1945. Japanese POWs stepped off transport trucks onto American farmland, bracing for the torture and execution their commanders promised, but instead, elderly farmers handed them work gloves and their wives brought out lemonade and sandwiches. These prisoners would witness something so shocking, so incompatible with everything they'd been told, that they'd spend the next 50 years hiding it from their own families. What could American farmers have possibly done that was more dangerous to reveal than the horrors of war itself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the summer of 1942, America was a nation at war and burning with rage. Just months earlier, Japanese planes had attacked Pearl Harbor, killing over 2,000 Americans in a single morning. The shock of that December day had turned into a fury that swept across the entire country like wildfire. Neighbors who had lived peacefully beside Japanese-American families for decades now viewed them with suspicion and hate. President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9006, and within weeks, over 100,000 people of Japanese descent were forced from their homes and locked behind barbed wire in desert camps. It did not matter if they were born in America or if their children wore American uniforms. Fear and anger had taken over.
The government had a solution that made many people angry and afraid. They would bring prisoners of war to the heartland of America and put them to work on farms. Not German prisoners, though there were plenty of those. Japanese prisoners. The same people whose faces appeared on hate posters in every town square. The same enemy that had killed American boys at Pearl Harbor and Bataan. These prisoners would be transported from camps on the coasts and brought right into small American communities where the rage still burnt hot. In a small farming town in Idaho, the news arrived like a thunderclap. The local newspaper announced that a prisoner of war camp would be built just 5 miles outside of town. Japanese soldiers would be housed there and brought out to work on local farms. The reaction was immediate and fierce. At the general store, men gathered and spoke in angry voices about how they would never allow enemy soldiers on their land. At church meetings, families whose sons were fighting in the Pacific said they would rather lose their entire crop than accept help from Japanese hands. The mayor received phone calls and letters demanding that the government change its mind. But the government did not change its mind. The camps were built quickly, simple wooden barracks surrounded by tall fences and guard towers. In the spring of 1943, the first trucks arrived carrying Japanese prisoners. These men had been captured in the Pacific Islands after brutal fighting. Some had been pulled from the ocean after their ships were sunk. Others had been found starving in jungle caves, too weak to fight anymore. They had surrendered, which, in their culture, meant they had already died. Their own emperor had declared them dead. Their families back in Japan would be told they had perished in battle, because surrender was worse than death. Movie theaters played newsreels showing Japanese soldiers as monsters with fangs and claws. Posters in post offices warned Americans that the enemy was sneaky and cruel. Radio programs told stories of Japanese brutality in China and across the Pacific Islands. Children in schools learned songs about fighting the Yellow Menace. The entire nation had been taught to see the Japanese as less than human, as a threat that had to be destroyed completely. This hatred was not just allowed, but encouraged by the government itself. At the same time, American farms were facing a crisis of their own. The war had pulled millions of young men away from their homes and sent them to fight in Europe and the Pacific. The fields that fed the nation now sat with crops rotting on the vine because there were not enough hands to pick them. In small farming towns across Idaho, Nebraska, Colorado, and other rural states, elderly farmers watched their life's work dying in the fields. Their sons were gone, fighting overseas. Their neighbors' sons were gone too. The harvest season came, and there was nobody left to bring in the wheat, the sugar beets, the potatoes, the corn.
The Japanese soldiers had been trained since childhood to believe certain things about Americans. They had been told that Americans were soft and weak, that they loved comfort more than honor. They had also been told that Americans were devils who would torture prisoners in terrible ways before killing them. Japanese officers had warned their men that surrender meant endless suffering. Some soldiers had killed themselves rather than be captured because they believed the stories so completely. The men who ended up in the American camps had expected to die the moment they were caught. When the prisoners first arrived at the camp in Idaho, they were processed and given clean uniforms. They were shown to barracks with real beds and blankets. They were fed meals of beef stew and bread with butter. This confused them. They waited for the torture to begin. They waited to be starved or beaten or worked to death. Instead, they were told they would be taken to farms to work in the fields. This, they thought, must be the beginning of their execution. They would be taken out to remote locations and shot.
The first morning that a truck arrived to take prisoners to a nearby farm, the men climbed aboard in silence. They had made peace with their deaths. Some had written final letters that they hid in their bunks, though they knew no one would ever send them home. The truck drove through the countryside past fields of green crops and farmhouses with American flags hanging from porches. The prisoners looked at these scenes and thought they would be the last things they ever saw. The truck stopped at a large farm where an old man stood waiting. He was at least 60 years old with weathered skin and rough hands. He wore overalls and a wide-brimmed hat to block the sun. He looked at the Japanese prisoners as they climbed down from the truck, and his face was hard to read. The prisoners stood in a line, waiting. The farmer walked closer. Then he did something none of them expected. He held out a pair of thick work gloves and gestured toward the field of sugar beets that stretched out behind his barn. No guns, no shouting, no violence. Just gloves and a field of crops that needed harvesting. The prisoners took the gloves with shaking hands and followed the old farmer into the field. They had been trained to pull sugar beets from the ground in quick, efficient motions, and they worked in silence under the hot Idaho sun. Every few minutes, one of them would glance toward the farmer, expecting him to pull out a weapon or start shouting orders. But the old man just worked alongside them, moving slowly but steadily down his own row. After an hour, he straightened up and wiped his forehead. He pointed toward a large oak tree at the edge of the field, where shade pooled like dark water. Then he said one word they understood: lunch. Under the tree sat a wooden crate covered with a cloth. The farmer pulled back the cloth and revealed thick sandwiches wrapped in brown paper, a glass jar filled with cold milk, and a bag of apples so red they looked like they had been painted. The prisoners stared. In the camps back in the Pacific, they had eaten small handfuls of rice mixed with whatever could be found. They had watched their friends die from hunger and disease. They had grown so thin that their uniforms hung off their bodies like draped sheets. And now this American farmer, whose country they had attacked, whose sons might be fighting their brothers at this very moment, was offering them more food than they had seen in months.
One prisoner reached out slowly and took a sandwich. He unwrapped it carefully and found thick slices of ham, cheese, fresh lettuce, and real butter spread on soft white bread. He took a bite and his eyes filled with tears. The other prisoners followed, eating slowly at first, then faster as their bodies remembered what real food felt like. The farmer sat with them and ate his own sandwich. He did not speak much because the language barrier was too wide, but he nodded at them when they looked his way. When the milk jar was empty, he walked back to his farmhouse and returned with more. This became their routine over the following weeks. Every morning, the truck would bring the same group of prisoners to the farm.
They would work through the morning hours, pulling beets or picking potatoes or hauling equipment. Then they would stop for lunch under the oak tree. The farmer's wife began preparing the lunches, and each day they grew more elaborate. Fresh cookies appeared, cold lemonade in summer, hot coffee when autumn came and the mornings turned cool. Sometimes she would walk out to the field herself, a small woman with gray hair and kind eyes, carrying a pitcher and cups on a wooden tray. The prisoners began to notice other things that shattered everything they had been taught. In the farmer's barn hung photographs of a young man in a military uniform. He had the same strong jaw as the old farmer and the same gentle eyes as his mother. The prisoners learned through gestures and broken English that this was the farmer's son. He was somewhere in the Pacific fighting against Japan. He might be on the very islands where these prisoners had been captured. He might have been the one who shot at them or dropped bombs on their positions. Yet here were his parents feeding Japanese soldiers and treating them like human beings. One prisoner, named Takeshi, had been a school teacher before the war. He understood more English than the others and began picking up phrases from the farmer. The old man's name was William, and his wife was called Dorothy. Their son's name was Robert, and he was a medic with the Marines. Dorothy showed Takeshi a letter from Robert that described the heat and rain and fear of the Pacific Islands. She cried as she read it, and Takeshi understood that this woman was terrified for her son. Yet still she brought them lemonade and smiled at them. As summer turned to fall, the prisoners witnessed the impossible abundance of American farms. Trucks arrived weekly, loaded with supplies. Gasoline for the tractors never ran out. The barn held enough tools for every task. The farmhouse had electricity that never failed and running water from pipes. When a piece of equipment broke, the farmer simply ordered a replacement from town, and it arrived within days. The prisoners thought about their own country, where cities were being bombed flat, where food had become so scarce that people ate bark and grass, where every scrap of metal was melted down for weapons. Yet here was America, fighting a war on two fronts across two oceans, and still the farms overflowed with plenty. The contrast cut deeper every day. At the POW camp, the prisoners were served 3 full meals. There was beef and pork and chicken. There were potatoes and carrots and fresh bread. On Sundays, the camp kitchen served ice cream in small bowls, something most of the prisoners had never tasted before. They learned to play baseball in the recreation yard. Guard towers surrounded the camp, but the guards were not cruel. They were often young men or older ones who had not passed the physical tests for combat duty. Some of them were friendly and would share cigarettes through the fence. One afternoon in October, a red Coca-Cola truck arrived at the farm to make a delivery to the main house. The prisoners watched as the driver unloaded case after case of glass bottles filled with the dark, sweet drink. The farmer bought 2 cases and brought them out to the field at lunch. He opened the bottles with a metal tool and handed them around. The prisoners tasted Coca-Cola for the first time, the bubbles sharp and strange on their tongues, the sweetness almost painful after years of nothing but rice and salt. They looked at each other with expressions that mixed wonder and grief. Takeshi began writing in a small notebook he kept hidden in his bunk. He wrote in Japanese characters so tiny that no one could read them without putting the page right up to their face. Takeshi wrote careful words in his hidden notebook every night because of the dim light that came through the barracks windows. He wrote about the sandwiches and the lemonade and the kindness that made no sense. He wrote about Dorothy's tears when she read letters from her son Robert. He wrote questions that had no answers. If Americans are demons, why do they feed us like guests? If we are fighting for honor, why does this feel like shame? He knew these words were dangerous. If the wrong person found this notebook, if the military police back in Japan ever read these thoughts, he could be executed as a traitor. But he could not stop writing. The truth was too large to keep inside his chest.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. November came cold and gray to Idaho. The last of the harvest was finished, and the fields lay bare and brown under heavy skies. The prisoners expected to be sent to different work assignments, or maybe returned to a camp on the coast. Instead, William, the farmer, asked the camp commander if the same work detail could come back to help prepare the farm for winter. There were fences to mend and equipment to store, and firewood to split. The commander agreed. The truck continued to arrive each morning, and the prisoners continued their strange double life of captivity and friendship. On the third Thursday of November, Dorothy came out to the barn where the prisoners were working. She spoke to her husband in English, and though the prisoners could not understand all the words, they heard one clearly: Thanksgiving. William nodded and turned to Takashi. Through gestures and simple words, he explained that there would be a special meal in 2 days, a holiday. The prisoners were invited to eat with the family in the barn.
The prisoners talked about this in whispers back at camp. Some of them were suspicious. Perhaps this was a trick or a test. Perhaps the Americans were checking to see who would become too friendly with the enemy. Others thought it was simply kindness and nothing more. Takeshi said they should accept the invitation because refusing would be rude, and they had been raised to value politeness above almost everything else. On Thanksgiving morning, they put on their cleanest uniforms and combed their hair with water. They looked like soldiers preparing for inspection rather than men going to dinner. When they arrived at the farm, the barn had been transformed. Long tables had been set up on sawhorses and covered with white cloth. Chairs were arranged on both sides. In the corner, a wood stove burned hot and filled the space with warmth that pushed back against the November cold. Dorothy and 2 women from neighboring farms had been cooking since dawn. The smells that filled the barn were unlike anything the prisoners had experienced. Roasted turkey, baked bread, sweet potatoes with butter and brown sugar, pumpkin pie cooling on a side table. Other farmers arrived with their families. These were William's neighbors, men who worked the surrounding farms and whose sons were also overseas. They came through the barn door, stamping snow from their boots and carrying covered dishes. They looked at the Japanese prisoners with expressions that were hard to read. Some faces showed anger that had not yet faded. Others showed curiosity. A few showed something that might have been pity or understanding. No one spoke directly to the prisoners at first. The Americans gathered on one side of the barn and talked among themselves in low voices. Then Dorothy rang a small bell and asked everyone to sit. She directed the prisoners to chairs at the tables, placing them between American families rather than segregating them to one end. Takeshi found himself sitting between William and a younger farmer whose name he learned was John. Across from him sat an elderly woman with white hair who smiled at him gently. The tables filled with platters of food, 3 turkeys, each one huge and golden, bowls of mashed potatoes with rivers of gravy, green beans with bacon, cranberry sauce that gleamed like dark rubies, rolls so soft and white they looked like clouds. The prisoners stared at the abundance and felt something break inside their chests. William stood at the head of the table and raised his glass. The barn fell silent. He spoke in English, his voice rough with emotion. He talked about the war and the boys who were far from home. He talked about the difficulty of these times and the pain that everyone carried. Then he said something that Takeshi would remember for the rest of his life. He said that even in war, even when nations fought each other with everything they had, people could still choose to be human. He said that sitting at a table together and sharing food was one of the oldest ways that humans showed respect for each other. He raised his glass higher and said, "To peace and better days for all of us." The Americans raised their glasses and repeated the words. The prisoners did not have glasses, but they raised their hands in the same gesture. Then William said they should eat, and the meal began. Plates were filled and passed. The Americans showed the prisoners how to carve turkey and spread cranberry sauce. They demonstrated the proper way to make a well and mash potatoes for gravy. John, the young farmer next to Takeshi, cut his own turkey into small pieces and put several slices on Takeshi's plate without being asked. Takeshi took his first bite of turkey and felt his throat close up. The meat was tender and rich and flavored with herbs he could not name. It was better than any food he had eaten in his entire life. He thought about the soldiers still fighting in the Pacific, starving in caves and eating roots to survive. He thought about his own family back in Japan, wondering if his wife and children had enough rice to last the winter. He thought about all the propaganda that had told him Americans were devils without souls. And here he sat in a warm barn, eating a feast prepared by the mother of a Marine who might kill Japanese soldiers tomorrow. Something broke inside him. Tears ran down his face and into his food. He tried to stop them but could not. His shoulders shook. The other prisoners at the table saw him crying, and some of them began crying too. The Americans did not know what to do. They looked at each other with worried faces. Dorothy stood up and came around the table. She put her hand on Takeshi's shoulder. This enemy soldier, this man whose countrymen had killed thousands of Americans. She patted his shoulder the way a mother comforts a child and said, "It's all right. It's all right." Takeshi looked up at her through his tears and tried to explain in his broken English. "You are good people," he said. "You are so good. Your son fights my country, but you feed us. You give us everything. We were told you are devils. We were told lies, all lies." His voice broke completely, and he put his head in his hands. The barn was silent except for the sound of men crying. William came and stood beside his wife. He put his hand on Takeshi's other shoulder. Other Americans came around the table. They did not hug the prisoners or try to comfort them with words. They simply stood near them, a quiet presence that said they understood. They understood that something had shattered. They understood that these men were realizing their entire world had been built on lies. After several minutes, Takeshi raised his head and wiped his face. He looked around at the Americans standing near him. He looked at the tables full of food. He looked at Dorothy, whose son was at war against his people, and saw only kindness in her eyes. He understood something that would change him forever. He understood that power was not what he had been taught. Power was not in weapons or empire or conquering other nations. Power was in this. Power was in being able to destroy your enemy, but choosing instead to feed him. Power was in treating people with dignity, even when you did not have to. He also understood something darker and more terrible. He understood that Japan had already lost this war. Not because of weapons or ships or planes. Japan had lost because they were fighting a nation that had so much abundance they could feed their enemies turkey and pie while fighting wars on two sides of the planet. Japan was starving. America was serving ice cream to prisoners. The contrast was so vast it made him dizzy. The war ended in August of 1945 with atomic fire over 2 Japanese cities. The prisoners in Idaho heard the news over camp loudspeakers and felt relief mixed with horror. Relief that the killing had stopped, horror at what had been done to their homeland. In the months that followed, they waited to be sent home. William and Dorothy came to visit the camp twice, bringing small gifts and saying goodbye to the men who had worked their farm for 2 years.
Dorothy hugged Takeshi and pressed something into his hand. When he opened his palm later, he found seeds wrapped in paper, tomato seeds from her garden. She had written one word on the paper in careful letters: remember.
The prisoners were processed for repatriation in early 1946. They were given their personal belongings and clean clothes for the journey. Takeshi had hidden several things in the lining of his bag: the tomato seeds, 3 photographs that William had given him showing the farm and the family, a small American flag that he had found blowing across a field one day, letters with addresses written in careful English. He knew these items could get him killed if the wrong people found them. In post-war Japan, anything American was suspicious. Fraternizing with the enemy was treason. But he could not leave these things behind. They were proof that what he had experienced was real. The ship that carried them across the Pacific was crowded and cold. The prisoners stood on deck as Japan came into view and felt their hearts sink. Even from miles away, they could see that the coastline looked wrong. Cities that should have been visible were simply gone, replaced by flat expanses of ash and rubble. As the ship docked, they saw people on the shore who looked like walking skeletons. Children with hollow eyes and distended bellies. Women in rags picking through garbage for anything edible. Old men sitting in the ruins with blank faces.
Takeshi walked down the gangplank and stepped onto Japanese soil for the first time in 4 years. The ground felt unsteady beneath his feet. Everything smelled like smoke and rot. He made his way through the crowds at the port, searching for familiar faces, but everyone looked like strangers. He had been told his family was alive and living in a shack made from sheets of metal and burnt wood. His wife had aged 20 years. His children, who had been 6 and 8 when he left, were now thin and quiet and looked at him like he was a ghost. They had been told he died in battle years ago. Seeing him alive confused them. His wife cried and held him, but her body felt like bird bones in his arms. That night, they ate a thin soup made from rice and vegetable scraps. There were 4 small bowls for 4 people. Takeshi thought about the Thanksgiving meal and felt sick with guilt. He could not tell them about America. When his wife asked what the prisoner camp was like, he said it was difficult and left it at that. When neighbors came to welcome him home and asked about the Americans, he said they were fair and did not elaborate. He learned quickly that speaking positively about the enemy was dangerous. Japan was occupied now by American forces, and the Japanese people were confused and angry and ashamed. Some blamed the military leaders for the disaster. Others blamed the Americans for the bombs. Everyone was trying to understand how their great empire had been reduced to rubble and starvation. Takeshi found work as a teacher again, though the school was just a tent with benches made from broken concrete. He taught children who came to class hungry and fell asleep at their desks. At night, he would take out the tomato seeds Dorothy had given him and look at them in the dim light of a candle. In the spring of 1947, he planted them in a small patch of dirt behind the shack. He told his wife they were Japanese seeds he had saved from before the war. The plants grew tall and strong, and they produced large red tomatoes that fed his family for weeks. His children asked where such good seeds came from. He said he could not remember. Years passed. Japan began to rebuild with American help. The occupation brought food and medicine and supplies. Takeshi watched as his countrymen slowly accepted that the Americans were not the monsters they had been taught to fear. He watched as trade began between the 2 nations. He watched as his own children grew up in a world where Japan and America were becoming partners instead of enemies. But he still said nothing about the farm in Idaho or the family who had treated him like a human being. It was not until the 1970s, nearly 30 years after the war ended, that Takeshi finally spoke the truth. His children were grown and had children of their own. Japan had become wealthy again.
One evening, his grandson asked him about the war. The boy was studying history in school and wanted to know what it was really like. Takeshi looked at this young person who had grown up with plenty, who had never known hunger or bombing raids, and decided it was time. He told his grandson about William and Dorothy. He told him about the Thanksgiving meal and the tears and the kindness that had shattered everything he believed. He told him about the tomatoes that still grew in his garden from American seeds. His grandson listened with wide eyes and asked why he had never spoken of this before. Takeshi was quiet for a long time before answering. "Because," he finally said, "those American farmers taught me that humanity exists even in war. They fed us when their own son was dying fighting our soldiers. That is a debt I carried in silence for 50 years because I did not know how to explain it." In 1985, 40 years after the war ended, Takeshi received a letter that changed everything. His hands shook as he opened the envelope with American stamps. Inside was a short note, written in careful English by someone named Margaret. She explained that she was William and Dorothy's granddaughter. She had found old photographs in her grandmother's attic after Dorothy passed away. The photographs showed Japanese men working in fields and sitting at tables during what looked like a holiday meal. On the back of one photo, Dorothy had written names and a date: Thanksgiving, 1944. One of the names was Takeshi. Margaret wrote that she was trying to find the men in the photographs because her grandmother had spoken about them often in her final years. Dorothy had said that those prisoners had taught her something important about forgiveness and humanity. Margaret wanted to know if Takeshi was still alive and if he remembered her grandparents. She included her address and phone number. At the bottom of the letter, she wrote that William had passed away in 1978, but that he had often wondered what happened to the Japanese men who worked his farm. Takeshi sat at his kitchen table and read the letter 3 times. His wife, who knew the full story now, put her hand on his shoulder and asked what he wanted to do. Takeshi looked at the letter and then at the tomato plants growing in his garden, descendants of the original seeds Dorothy had given him. He knew what he had to do. He had carried this debt for 40 years. It was time to pay it back. 6 months later, Takeshi stepped off an airplane in Boise, Idaho. He was 70 years old now, and the journey had exhausted him. But his heart pounded with an energy he had not felt in decades. His grandson traveled with him, the same young man he had told the story 2 years before. Margaret met them at the airport holding a sign with Takeshi's name. She was a woman in her 40s, with Dorothy's kind eyes and William's strong jaw. When she saw Takeshi, she smiled and came forward with her hand extended. But Takeshi did not shake her hand. He bowed deeply, a formal bow of someone repaying an enormous debt. Margaret drove them to the farm, which was now run by her father, Robert, the Marine who had survived the Pacific War. The truck rolled down the same dirt road that Takeshi had traveled in the back of a military vehicle 40 years earlier. Everything looked smaller than he remembered, but also exactly the same. The barn still stood. The oak tree where they had eaten lunch was larger now, its branches spreading wide and strong. The fields were green with crops. Robert came out of the farmhouse when he heard the truck. He was in his 60s now, his hair gray and his face lined with age. He walked with a slight limp from an old war injury. When he saw Takeshi, he stopped. The 2 men looked at each other across the yard. One had been a prisoner. One had been a soldier fighting the prisoners' army. They had never met during the war, but they were connected by the kindness of 2 people who had refused to let hate win. Robert walked forward and extended his hand. Takeshi took it, and the 2 men shook firmly. Robert's eyes were wet. "My mother talked about you," he said. "She said you were a good man who had been caught up in a bad war.
She said she prayed for you. Takeshi's English was much better now after years of study, and he was able to respond. "Your mother and father saved my soul," he said. "They showed me that the enemy was not evil. They showed me that people are just people."
They walked to the barn together, and Margaret brought out a box of photographs and letters. There were dozens of pictures from those years when prisoners worked the farm. Images of men pulling sugar beets and eating lunch under the oak tree. A photograph of the Thanksgiving dinner with Takeshi's tear-stained face visible at the table. Letters that Dorothy had written but never sent, describing the prisoners and wondering what had become of them after they went home. Takeshi opened his own bag and brought out the things he had carried, the photographs William had given him, the small American flag, a jar of seeds from the tomatoes that had grown from Dorothy's original gift. He explained that he had been planting these tomatoes every year for 40 years, and that they had fed his family through the hardest times. He said that every time he ate one, he thought of Dorothy and William and gave thanks. Robert held the jar of seeds and wiped his eyes. "She would have loved this," he said. "She would have loved knowing that something she gave you kept growing." They sat in the barn where the Thanksgiving meal had happened, and Takeshi told stories. He described the moment he first tasted turkey, the shock of kindness when he expected cruelty, the way Dorothy's hand on his shoulder had broken through years of propaganda and hate. He talked about going home to a destroyed Japan and not being able to speak about any of this for fear of being called a traitor. Robert listened and nodded. Then he told his own story. He described fighting on Pacific Islands and seeing Japanese soldiers as the enemy, as something less than human. He talked about coming home after the war and learning that his parents had been feeding Japanese prisoners. He admitted that, at first, he had been angry. How could they be kind to the people who had killed his friends? But his mother had sat him down and explained that hate only breeds more hate. She said that the prisoners were somebody's sons too, somebody's husbands and fathers. She said that treating them with dignity was not betraying America. It was showing the world what America truly was. "She changed how I saw everything," Robert said. "I went back to school on the GI Bill and became a teacher. I spent 30 years teaching kids that people from other countries are not our enemies, that differences in culture or language or government do not make someone less human. I taught them what my parents taught me." Takeshi learned that he was not the only prisoner who had reconnected with the farming families. Margaret explained that she had found 5 other men from the photographs. 2 had already passed away, but 3 were still alive in Japan. They had all kept their experiences secret for decades. They had all carried the weight of a kindness they could not explain. And they had all, in their own ways, tried to pass that lesson forward. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.